So, Peter Behrendt. This is a guy who makes things happen. He's got a really impressive resume. He graduated from UCLA in engineering, and then went to work for IBM for 26 years in various executive positions. Then in 1987, he joined Exabyte as its president. And Exabyte was the company that did the design, manufacture, and sale of computer tape drives and libraries. Unfortunately, at that time in 1987, Exabyte had a revenue stream of 0. So this wasn't necessarily the greatest place to become president. But within 9 years, Peter had turned the company around. It had almost $400 million in sales and $1 billion in market capitalization. So this was a very impressive record. Exabyte became one of the 25 fastest growing companies in the United States and became the largest business of its type by the time that Peter left it in the mid-90s. Peter has won lots of awards. Boulder Business Person of the Year, Colorado Business Person of the Year. He speaks all over the world, but it's what's not in his resume that we're going to hear about today, because Peter survived the Holocaust as a hidden child in Germany. And after the Holocaust was over, he spent much of his youth under communist rule in East Germany. So please join me in welcoming Peter Behrendt.
Thank you very much. It's nice to see so many young people here, although I'm not sure it's optional. And it's also nice to see some other folks who've lived a little bit longer. I enjoy this kind of audience. I wrote some notes, primarily to help you remember what to talk about, but this should also give you some assurance that I'll know when to stop, which is a problem for people when they talk about their own lives. There's a tendency to do it in real time, and that doesn't work too well. I very rarely talk about this subject. There are friends and colleagues that have known me for several decades who really don't know this story. So you're all very special to hear this today. Why haven't I talked very much about this? I think I've done it maybe 3 times in my entire life. And the first reason is that it's not particularly enjoyable to talk about. Secondly, I don't like the idea of being defined by being a Holocaust survivor. I don't want to go around and have people say, look, there's Peter, the Holocaust survivor. That's not what I'm all about. I would much prefer to be focusing on the present and on the future and to be known for some of the things I've been able to accomplish than merely the fact that I happen to survive a Holocaust. It's nothing to be ashamed about, but it's not what I want to be known for. Thirdly, about 20 or even 10 years ago, there were lots of people who were able to talk about having been in the Holocaust, having survived it, and perhaps having more compelling stories than I. And there are some who are, let's call them, professional Holocaust survivors who go around the world talking about it. I think that's wonderful. It's just not my thing. So why talk about it now? There are several reasons. One is I had some very powerful and forceful encouragement from your professor. But also, there are obviously fewer and fewer survivors who can talk about this. Last year, and I think there's another one coming up, the Colorado governor holds a conference in Denver to commemorate the Holocaust. Last year there were about 1,600 guests at this thing, including the governor, And they had invited as many people as they could, survivors as many people as they could from around Colorado. And there were about 12 of them. Most of them were on walkers. Many of them were on oxygen, had trouble walking up to the bima to light the candle. So there are not many left. I'm fortunate that the rabbi afterward mentioned that he's pretty certain I'm the only Holocaust survivor who still skis 70 days a year. I think that's a significant observation. I'm also talking about it now because I'm increasingly concerned about what's going on around the world and the revival of anti-Semitism in so many places. In East Germany, where I grew up, the right-wing neo-fascists are gaining in power. In France, of course, lots of problems. I think, if I remember, 1% of the population in France is Jewish. 50% of the hate crimes are against that 1%. And even in the US, even in Boulder at times, there are problems, including at universities like my alma mater at UCLA and Stanford, which really bothers me. And why is it that I think this is happening? I'm no expert at this, but I have some theories. I think one is because of the growing number and activity of Muslim extremists around the world. I think personally Israel's policy in some cases is not helping matters because it is kind of easy to move from being anti-Israel to being anti-Semitic. That's a fine line in the minds of many people. There's a general movement to the political right in many places in Europe and elsewhere with strengthening of extremist parties. And perhaps most of all is the tremendous impact of social media and the internet. It used to be if you had some kind of nutcase with a particularly idiotic point of view, he could maybe, or she in some cases, but usually he could share that with maybe 100 people that he got hold of. Now that same nutcase can post his idiotic point of view on the internet and reach millions of people. Through websites that focus on that particular point of view. And I think that's been a big factor in what's happening. Obviously, people who can speak about the Holocaust in the first person are a more powerful voice than others, particularly with respect to the Holocaust deniers that still seem to exist in spite of a fair amount of evidence. About 6.2 million Jews were killed, including 1.5 million children. The 40 relatives I lost in the camps were certainly not eaten by ants at a picnic. So I think, I have a hard time understanding the deniers. But speaking now is more important than ever, while our voices can still be heard. There are not many. After all, the war ended in 1945, 70 years ago. There weren't that many survivors in the first place. The ones who were well along at that time may not be able to remember, and the ones who were very young can't remember because they were too young. So there are very few of us, and when we are gone, the Holocaust will be treated in books and in movies, but will be sort of like the battles of the Civil War, with nobody who can speak in the first person. So those of us who are still lucky enough to be vertical have an obligation, I think, now to share the story. I was fortunate. My mother recorded some 18 audio tapes about her life. My youngest son, Andrew, who lives in Vail, graduated from CU with a degree in creative writing and has been working on a book of her story based on those tapes and a lot of original research. My oldest son, Tony, in back, is videotaping this, so I want you to applaud wildly at the end because it's for posterity. All right, Peter, get to your story already. I was born Jewish in Berlin in November 1938. That was a really, really, really stupid thing to do. And I've had some discussions with my parents about the importance of planning. That was the month of the infamous Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, during which the Nazi thugs in Berlin burnt down every synagogue, broke the windows of most Jewish businesses, and then forced the Jews to pay for cleaning up the mess. This was clearly the strongest clue yet that Jews would be in for a difficult time in Nazi Germany. During the week I was born, some new edicts dealing with Berlin's Jews were published. From then on, Jewish kids were not allowed to go to school. They and adults were not allowed outdoors in central Berlin and in most other areas. No public transport could be used, which means they couldn't work. No phones were allowed. Imagine that, no phones. No contact with outsiders except family members. No homing pigeons. Now that really hurt. I don't know what the Nazis were worried about. Maybe they thought that the homing pigeons could knock down the Air Force planes or something like that. It was a rule. No radios or cameras were allowed. They had to be turned in. No buying of fruit, shaving cream, eggs, tobacco, candy, or clothing. And of course, the wearing of the yellow star on the outside of the clothes and the posting of those outside your apartment door for all to see. There was also a new rule about naming newborn Jewish children. All boys by law had to be named either Israel or Denny, D-E-N-N-Y. All girls had to be named either Sarah or Daisy. Those are very non-German names, and Nazis, being nothing but efficient, found that as a way to immediately identify Jewish children. So I was born as Denny Behrendt, even though I was introduced here as Peter Behrendt, but obviously that was not my name at birth, and we'll talk later about how that changed. I have no siblings. I believe that's because my parents recognized perfection when they saw it and concluded that they wouldn't be able to do any better than they already had. More likely, they understood that this was not a particularly good time to bring additional children into the world. It's possible or even probable that even I was a mistake. Although at age 94, my mother allowed that maybe having me hadn't been such a bad idea after all. Of course, she also told me that if my wife Barbara, who was here, and I ever got divorced, she would keep Barbara. It's very harsh coming from your own mother, and I think it's probably the cause of my complete lack of self-esteem. I had a fairly large family with grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and so on. My father was quite tall, good looking like all the men in my family, an excellent public speaker. He was trained as a chemist and as a businessman, spoke several languages, but no English. My mother, like most women born around 1912, had relatively little formal education, but she learned to be an accountant in the trade school. She was smart as hell, as was my dad, and she, at age 60, went back to high school in Los Angeles to get her degree, took college courses. Also at age 60, she began to play bridge and became a life master, which is, as those of you who know bridge know, is very difficult and a rare achievement. Both of my parents played several instruments, a skill that apparently skipped a generation, possibly two actually. I much later did take up the mandatory piano lessons for 2 years, at which point my mother sold the piano and used the money to buy a vacuum cleaner because it sounded better. So you ask, how did these two meet in a large city like Berlin? My mother was working as a bookkeeper for some firm, and her boss thought that she was kind of cute and smart and wanted her to go out with his cousin, Martin, my dad. And she said, well, he's very tall and I'm very short. And presumably with a smile, she said to her boss, you're going to have to buy me a pair of shoes with high heels if I'm going to go out with him. She got her shoes, she got her man. My mother was a very determined lady, as you can tell, which she needed to be throughout her life. We lived in a rented apartment in Berlin. Because of being Jewish, my dad lost his job. My mother was forced to work in a furniture factory, forced labor, applying some very toxic chemicals to chairs and so on. The fumes from that damaged her health permanently. Also during that time, my dad contracted some kind of infection in his hip, which the hospital refused to treat, not allowing Jews for treatment. And as a result, his hip became permanently frozen, and he walked with a cane for the rest of his life. That sounds unfortunate, but as you'll hear later, that was a very important event. See, I'm building suspense. My mother's brother and his wife decided to leave Germany in 1938. My parents also thought about that, but with a new baby and two sets of elderly parents, that seemed very difficult to do. Because the Nazis confiscated all Jewish people's passports, Jews were essentially stateless, which meant that no country, or virtually no country in the world, would accept them. The UK didn't, the United States wouldn't let them in. There were quite a few anti-Semitic folks in the State Department, and they claimed that all these European Jews were communists and therefore shouldn't be allowed into the country. The Dominican Republic took a very few number of Jews, but most of them who were able to leave Germany, of all places, were accepted by Shanghai in China. And there were some 30,000 European Jews who managed to get there, often after a very difficult journey by sea, very long journey. But they got there and they stayed throughout the war. It was not a particularly pleasant life, particularly after the Japanese overran Shanghai. And as you know, the Japanese were aligned with the Germans, and the Germans sent the head of the Gestapo to Shanghai, asking the Japanese to kill all the Jews in Shanghai. The Japanese didn't quite know why they would want to do that, but they had to do something to preserve the relationship. And so they took all the 30,000 Jews and moved them into a block, a few square blocks area, where 150,000 Chinese were already living. And obviously that caused tremendous overcrowding and health issues, rats, malaria, all of those things. But, and the Japanese had a tendency to beat the Jews as well. But obviously that was a hell of a lot better than being in a German concentration camp. On one of the many China trips Barbara and I have taken, we actually visited that area, and it's still a pretty difficult place to envision living, but it saved many lives. Of course, my uncle had every reason to assume that we had perished in Germany, like so many millions of others, until after the war, when the Red Cross found him in Shanghai, and to his amazement and joy, he got a telegram saying that we were alive. My uncle and his wife lived there from 38 to 46, and then they emigrated to Los Angeles, which is why ultimately we ended up there. Now, let's go back to Berlin. One day, shortly after I was born, a neighbor knocked on the door saying that the Gestapo was in the next block rounding up all the Jews. Within 2 minutes, my parents raced out the back door of the building, fortunately remembering to grab me, but nothing else. And they left the building through the back as the Nazis came in through the front door. For a few days, we stayed with friends trying to figure out where to go. And we had some non-Jewish friends who owned a small vacation cottage on the outskirts of Berlin, which had a basement, really a coal cellar. And they offered to let us stay there. It was about 10 by 10 feet, had no electricity, no heat, no toilet, no water. And I was quite young while we stayed there for 4 years. And I don't remember all of the inconveniences, but I do recall it was quite dark and cold and moist. And my mother contracted some serious rheumatism because of those conditions. So how did we get food to survive that long in hiding? Among his other talents, my dad was an excellent amateur painter, another skill that skipped at least one generation. And he started to produce oil paintings from memory by candlelight, which non-Jewish friends then traded for food. They took a huge risk, since hiding or helping Jews was punishable by death. Getting oil paint was not a problem, but getting canvas was, because canvas was used to go into the uniforms of millions of German soldiers, and therefore it was impossible to get. My parents came up with an ingenious solution. As most of you know, the Nazis confiscated thousands of paintings from the Jews that were arrested or escaped. Maybe you saw the movie Monument Men or Lady in Gold or something like that. It deals with that particular aspect. Naturally, many of those paintings had a Jewish theme, maybe had a rabbi in it or some other related subject. And no self-respecting Nazi would hang one of those paintings in his home. So most of those ended up in pawn shops, and there was absolutely no demand for them. So my parents' friends purchased those paintings with frames, and my dad would overpaint those paintings, and then those were traded for food. I hate to think of this painting a landscape over perhaps a Rembrandt or something like that. But that's what had to be done, and he painted something like 150 pictures during that time. When I was about 3 or 4, I became very ill. As you can imagine, living in a cellar with no milk, very little food, and never being able to set foot outside during the daylight, that's not conducive to good health. And my parents, with good reasons, were quite worried about me. There was a lady my parents had never met who had gotten some of my dad's paintings. And I don't know exactly how this arrangement was made, but she offered to let me stay with her, claiming that I was a long-lost nephew. The trick, she lived with her family in a farmhouse in a tiny village in Saxony, near what is now the Polish and Czech border, near Dresden. About 200 miles from Berlin. The tricky part was how to get me out of the cellar without arousing suspicion, and how to get me on a train to go stay with her. She sent her brother, who was a major in the German Air Force, and he came to the house where we were hiding in full uniform and walked me out, and nobody really raised any suspicion because he was high-ranking in the military. This was obviously a very difficult decision for my parents, since there was no way we could know if we would ever see each other. I stayed with that lady for 9 months. I learned to milk cows and butcher chickens, something I haven't needed to do recently. And I completely recovered. I don't know how long I would have stayed there, probably throughout the war. But Aunt Liesel, as I called her, made some derogatory remarks about Hitler. She was arrested and sentenced to death. Ironic, that was the reason, rather than hiding a Jew, which also was punishable by death. Somehow she was pardoned, but because of that, I had to return to my family in Berlin, and at age 4, once again, into the cellar. During all that time, my mother's mother also lived in Berlin under an assumed name as a companion of an elderly lady. My 5th birthday, November 27, 1943, was a day of record-breaking bombing of Berlin. I think of the entire period, more bombs were dropped by US and English, British airplanes than at any other day. There were quite a few large trees right behind the cottage where we were hiding. And bombs were raining down all around the cottage and into these trees. And several hit the trees, and they collapsed, fell onto the cottage and completely collapsed the cottage so that we were trapped in the cellar. I remember I had just played with my birthday present, which was a small train made up of wooden blocks with a few wheels. Could never find the damn thing again. That was very different from the computerized toys my 3-year-old grandson plays with today, but I loved that thing. I don't know how my parents managed to get it. Anyway, we were trapped in the cellar for 4 days. Nobody was looking for us because the owners of the cottage had been killed in a bombing raid, and others, friends, were either afraid to come or they assumed we were dead too. Now, normally this would not have been a happy situation, as you can well imagine. But as it turns out, it really saved our lives. My parents assumed that after some time, someone would come looking for us. And during those 4 days while trapped, they decided to make up a whole new life history. If found, they would claim that all of our papers and IDs had been lost during that collapse. We would become some other religion, Protestants or Zoroastrians or something, I don't know exactly what. They would come up with completely new names. My dad, Martin Behrendt, would become Max Berger. I became Peter Berger overnight instead of Denny, which was a sure giveaway, of course. And for the rest of my life, I was therefore called Peter, except by my Shanghai uncle, who knew me as the baby Denny and never got over using that name. My mother, for some reason, kept her name Gerda, and I made Peter part of my official name when I became a US citizen, so it's Peter Denny Behrendt. For hours on end, they made up a myriad of details about their new life, and practice. When finally found, they claimed they were just regular unfortunate Germans who had been clobbered by the bombs like so many other Germans, that they had no place to live. At this point, the fact that my dad could only walk with a cane, you remember this, was very fortunate, because without that he would have been immediately drafted into the German army, and this kept him out. Berlin had been almost totally destroyed at this point by bombs, and there was absolutely no available housing for anybody. So ultimately the authorities, who had fully bought this fake story that my parents made up, relocated us to a very small resort-like village of about 1,000 people in Saxony, coincidentally only miles from where I had lived as in the farmhouse with this lady. We lived in a rather nice house on the outskirts of the village, owned by an 80-year-old lady and her companion, housekeeper. And the Nazis forced them to give us, the 3 of us and my grandmother, an attic room. They later claimed they suspected we might have been Jewish, but they didn't want to know. And I don't know if that's true or not, but they treated us well. We lived there as the Berger family for 2 years, from 1943 till the end of the war. I love being able to play outside, to have friends. I went to school as Peter Berger, first and second grade in a tiny one-room school. During the winter, I sometimes had to ski to school, which I hated because it seemed like uphill in both directions. Sometimes my mother pulled me there on a sled, which I liked much better. So in school, I sang the Nazi songs like every other kid. Of course, I didn't know I was Jewish, and I couldn't know that I was Jewish. My parents were not particularly pleased when one day I came home wearing the mandatory swastika armband, knocked on the table, and yelled, "Gestapo, open up." They were not amused, but what are you going to do? My dad continued to paint, signing his pictures as Max Berger, and continuing to trade them for food, which was very hard to come by. These were very difficult times, not just for us, but for all Germans. Due to the bombings, there was a huge food shortage during the last few years of the war, which was, of course, not going well for the Germans, and most supplies were diverted to the military. Come May 8th, 1945, and we learned that the Germans had been defeated by the Allied forces. The Russians were coming to our area, crossing mountain passes in their tanks. I remember standing on the roof of our house waving at the Russian planes overhead. My parents were crying, jumping up and down. The Germans were panicked since they had heard stories about the horrible treatment by the Russians in the areas that they had conquered. Those stories were true. Many of the Russian soldiers were very primitive and unsophisticated men coming from the steppes of Russia. They raped, they murdered, generally made life miserable. They stole every watch they could find and then threw them away because they didn't know how to wind them. It was not a good time. Whenever we saw a Russian truck coming up the long driveway to our house, my mother and grandmother would run up to the attic and hide there with a door covered by a large piece of furniture that my dad had put some wheels under. It was a painful time for the Germans, but we were thrilled. We had survived. We changed our name back to Behrendt. My dad signed his paintings again with his real name, the watershed moment. We thought all was good, even though we were now living in communist East Germany. To the best of my knowledge, we were the only three-generation family that survived the Holocaust hiding in Germany. The Germans in the world paid a very high price for the Holocaust atrocity, and not just in terms of personal tragedies, which of course were immense. Think about it, there are roughly 15 million Jews in the world and research. And among them, they've collected something like 250 Nobel Prizes. I don't know of any other group that managed to do that. Actually, with that ratio, I feel left out. I mean, is one small Nobel Peace Prize too much to ask for? Or as one of my favorite comedians, Stephen Wright, said that I'd kill for a Nobel Peace Prize. Now think, if there were 6 more million Jews and their children in the world, what a difference they could have made. They could have cured diseases like Salk did with polio. How many scientific discoveries like Einstein's might have been made? How many books and plays written, music and movies produced, professors created? Germany understands that cost now, which pleases me, because it hasn't always been the case. 4 years ago, when Bob and I went to Berlin, we saw a giant exhibit called What We Lost. And it showed very large photographs of hundreds of artists, scientists, musicians, composers, and their bios of all of the great Jewish minds that were lost to Germany, either because they were killed or because they emigrated. It was a very impressive list and a very large cost that Germany bore. Robin Williams was once asked on German television why there are so few German comedians. And he said, because you killed them all. Interview did not go well. There was a larger town nearby the village where we had hidden, a town named Zittau, Z-I-T-T-A-U, about 40,000 people. Very old town going back to 1500. The king of Bohemia had granted them a beer-making license then, which resulted in a lot of prosperity. They still make good beer. It was also the trade route between Prague and Germany, which made it a very important little town. We moved to Zittau after the war from the village. The largest employer in town was a textile plant that had employed about 4,000 people, so 10% of the population. And although there was virtually no bomb damage to that town, some British plane had mistaken that particular factory for a munitions plant that was many miles away and had destroyed it. And the Russians were very concerned that the biggest employer in town was gone and the problems that would cause. The Russians distrusted all Germans, thinking they'd all been Nazis. When they found out that my dad was Jewish and therefore probably not a former Nazi, and that he had a background in chemistry and textile manufacturing and business, they were thrilled. And they gave him the land where this factory had been located and asked him to quickly rebuild the factory to provide employment again for the town. He ran that firm from 1946 to 1953. It became the largest privately owned enterprise in all of East Germany, very successful. We lived a good life in spite of the political oppression in communist Germany. My dad refused to join the Communist Party, which did not endear him to the local authorities. We owned a very nice apartment, drove one of the few cars in town, a 1938 giant black Opel sedan. My mother was the only female in town with a driver's license. She was a very beautiful, sophisticated woman. All my friends and even my teachers fell in love with her. My dad was the big man in town and responsible for many improvements that were made that still exist today. 1951, I had my bar mitzvah. It was the first in all of East Germany. This was 6 years after the war ended. And this gives you some idea how few Jewish children survived. First one in 6 years. Of course, there was no rabbi in the country. I learned Hebrew, in quotes, from a linguist who spoke 13 languages. He thought of Hebrew as a language rather than, really devoid of any spiritual connotation, but he taught me Hebrew. The bar mitzvah was held in a small surviving synagogue in Dresden, about 100 miles from where we live. The rabbi had to be flown in from West Germany, ultra-Orthodox. He put me through rituals that I thought were rather strange. He put something like a matchbox on my forehead. He wrapped leather strings up my arms. I had no clue what the hell was going on. But the presents I got were nice. And because of the rarity of the event, the few remaining Jews from all over the country attended. So it was a big deal. The success of my dad's factory didn't really please the authorities, since all of similar businesses were at that point state-owned rather than private and struggling due to mismanagement and corruption. So they decided they wanted to nationalize my dad's business as well. And to do that, of course, you needed an excuse. There was a law stating that if you had any metal lying around, steel pipes, copper tubing, whatever that wasn't being used, it had to be turned into the government to be converted into weapons. My dad had a couple of irreplaceable textile-related machines stored under canvas, waiting for permission from the government to put up a building to house those. He'd been waiting for 2 years without getting those. The government decreed that by not turning in these machines, he had committed sabotage against the state. And this was good enough reason to nationalize the business. They arrested my dad and his management team. I was sitting in my high school 10th grade chemistry class. A family friend who worked in the police department called my mother and told her that 2 police cars had just been dispatched to arrest her as well because she was part owner. My mother hopped onto a bicycle to avoid detention, rode to school, got me out of class, and we took off again with no notice for the second time in her life. So this is not really part of the Holocaust story, but I'll finish it off. This was before the wall between East and West Berlin was erected, but we had to find a way to get the 200 miles from Zittau to Berlin. And of course the authorities were looking for us, and there were checkpoints at all airports and bus terminals and major highways. So we had to travel at night, basically watching, catching rides on hay wagons, a couple of times riding on stolen bicycles and so on. Obviously we were traveling light. It took about 5 days until we were able to reach Berlin and cross into the American sector. In Berlin we lived in a refugee camp for about a year, along with many other refugees, mostly from Eastern Europe. Not a pleasant place, crowded, many people per room, with privacy only coming from sheets hanging from the ceiling. During that time there was a huge show trial in Zittau with quite anti-Semitic overtones involving my dad and his colleagues. The authorities were hoping to make a point. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and forfeiting all property, which of course included the factory, which was the point of the whole exercise. He was sent to a prison built during Napoleon's time to house at that time 300 criminals. And when he went there, they held over 1,000 political prisoners in really lousy conditions. The ironic name of the prison was Waldheim, which means home in the forest. My son Andrew and I toured the place as part of the research for his book, and it's still a terrible place. After 4 years, he became very ill and he was released. And the communists actually let him leave the country because they didn't want to deal with his illness. And he was able to join us in Los Angeles, but lived only 2 years after that. After a year in the refugee camp, we were able to emigrate to the United States and arrived in Los Angeles to be with my mother's brother and his wife for the first time since 1938. My mother almost immediately got a job as a housekeeper in Beverly Hills. We lived with that family. And so on a Monday, I was in a refugee camp in Berlin. And on a Friday, I was a junior at Beverly Hills High School. A bit of culture shock, actually. As a matter of fact, years later, when I decided to leave IBM to run a zero-revenue startup, the venture capitalists told me about 20 times, no, you can't do that. Going from IBM to a startup is too much of a culture shock. I heard that about 20 times, and it really bugged me. So finally, I mentioned that, I'd gone from a refugee camp to Beverly High, probably more of a culture shock than they were concerned about, and I'd handled it reasonably well, and I got the job. After that, they shut up. But it was a culture shock. In East Germany, we had to study German, of course, plus Latin, plus 8 years of Russian. Later on, I picked up some other languages as well. But we were not allowed to learn English, either in school or privately. So my total English vocabulary when we arrived consisted of 3 or 4 words, depending on how you counted: cowboy, chewing gum, and sweetheart. This did not impress the girls of Beverly High very much, I must say. I was the only non-native born students in the entire school except for 2 exchange students. This was a great advantage because it forced me to learn English quickly, as it did my mother. Fortunately, we arrived in the United States with some money. Between my mother and myself, we had $8, and I was able to more than double that since then, I'm glad to say. After graduation, I went on to Los Angeles City College for 2 years because it was affordable. My English still wasn't perfect, I guess it still isn't, but I decided I needed to force myself to speak more English publicly. So I decided to run for student body president. At a debate in front of the 16,000 students, I apparently mispronounced a word. I don't even remember what it was. And my opponent, Pam, pounced on that and says, now, do you really want a student body president who can't even pronounce whatever that word was? And people kind of laughed. And I said, well, Pam may be right, and what's worse, I can make that same kind of mistake in 6 other languages. At which point, there was a little bit more laughter, and that was the end of Pam. And I won. Later, I transferred to UCLA, majored in nuclear engineering with a minor in philosophy. After UCLA, I spent a short time as a goodwill ambassador for the State Department, traveling around India, making nice. I guess the State Department thought I was a typical American to send over there. Went to work for IBM for 27 years, moved my family, 8 times, I think, during that time. My mother moved with us each time without living with us, but she wanted to be close to Barbara and the grandchildren, and it was okay that I was there as well. Retired at 48, ran a startup company in Boulder for quite a few years, which became a quite successful public company. Retired from that, served on numerous boards, which I still do. Taught entrepreneurship in the engineering school here at CU. Traveled the world. We've been in, some 80 countries, I think, on every continent, and skied. So that's my story. Thanks for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time, Paul, do we?
Yeah.
Questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, since when you were a child, in your early years, and you were not aware that you were a Jew, and then how did your parents tell you? And what was your reaction when they did tell you?
The question was, how did my parents tell me that I was Jewish, and what was my reaction? I don't think I had a huge reaction. For one thing, I didn't know any other Jews, so I didn't really understand what that meant at that age. It was, all right, what else is new? So it did not come as a major life-altering event, and I think you can understand why. I had no frame of reference what that meant. It kind of explained a couple of things, why we had been in hiding and all of that. But other than that, I think I managed it reasonably well. Yes?
Peter, what is your reference today about the driving influence behind the Nazis' hatred of the Jews?
Here's the question. Well, it didn't begin with the Nazis. There are museums in Berlin and elsewhere that we've seen that really demonstrate that anti-Semitism goes back, to the 13th or 12th century in Spain and lots of other places. So I think it was a continuation of a long history of people picking on the Jews. I think in the case of Nazis and in lots of other places, if you are trying to unite a people, you have to define a common enemy. And the Jews in Berlin and in Germany, who were very prominent in industry and science and professions, were a easy target which Hitler used to really unite the Germans behind him. Having a common enemy is a very powerful force for moving your agenda, and I think that's behind that. Any other questions? Yes?
When you were in East Germany after the war, when you were absorbed by communism,
Yeah.
did you and your family ever think about leaving earlier?
The question was if in East Germany we ever thought about leaving earlier rather than having been forced by my dad's arrest, I think. Probably not. As I mentioned, we led a pretty good life. We didn't anticipate the way things would work out. And particularly after having been forced to leave home, so to speak, once before, it's not an easy decision. Where would we have gone? West Germany, perhaps, but I don't think my parents really felt highly motivated to do that and to give up what was a fairly pleasant life for uncertainty of ending up someplace where they weren't known and what would have happened. Good question. Yes, ma'am.
Outside of the main culture shock, was there any stigma being a German-speaking German in 1950s America?
Was there anything difficult, I guess, about being a German-speaking citizen in the U.S.? I wouldn't say so. I think, I don't know if you know much about Beverly Hills High School, but it was different from most high schools. A lot of Hollywood kids and things like that, a lot of money. So I think the harder part was sort of being an odd duck, not speaking the language, not having money, working, being the son of a housekeeper rather than a movie star. So I think that was more of a problem than the fact that I was German speaking. But I have to say, they treated me very nicely. I still have good friends from those days. I kind of go to our reunion in October. And I was maybe a bit of a curiosity, which didn't hurt. So that aspect was not a problem. I've also gone back a number of times to my 8th grade reunion in Germany. That was a very interesting experience because I was the only one really who left Zittau, got away, so to speak. They all live in the same houses still pretty much. They were all unemployed because when the wall came down, all industry in East Germany came to a halt because all their products were crappy, basically. And first time I went there, our teacher was there, Max, who was, I think, 79 or 80 at the time. And he asked each of us to give a little talk about what we've been up to since high school, which was a long time ago. And, Hans would get up and say, well, I was an automobile mechanic for 30 years and now I'm unemployed. And our teacher took out a giant spreadsheet, a piece of paper. And he said, Hans, in school you got a 3 in Russian and you had a 2 in gym and you had a 1 in math and you had a 4 in this. He kept our damn grades all these years. And we later found out that we'd been his first class ever, which we didn't know at the time. And but that was difficult for me because everybody was unemployed, everybody was having a hard time. And here comes Peter. How do you talk about having multiple houses and more cars and you got drivers and traveling all over the place to people in that position? So I had to really tone it down, and I did. I had our marketing department make up 25 t-shirts for every boy in my class. Gotten a picture of our class when we were in school. And we were in a small village for 2 days and 2 nights, terrorized the town in identical t-shirts. That was a very interesting experience. And by the way, Barbara and I, on May 7th, are going back to Berlin at the invitation of the Berlin Senate, which is an interesting event. Apparently they have a program where they invite Jews who had to leave Berlin during the Hitler time to come back for a week. They're sending us tickets, they've got us opera tickets, put us up at a nice hotel, have a guide, we're having lunch with the Senate, and I'm still trying to understand exactly what the motivation is. I suspect it's a combination of trying to make up a little bit of guilt. I don't think they want the Jews to come back, certainly not people in our age, would be nothing but a burden, which is a shame because I came up with a great term if they were doing that, would be rejuvenation. But I don't think that's the intent, but we look forward to going back to Berlin at their invitation. I have to say that I've spent a lot of time in Germany in business, both for IBM and for Exabyte, and for many years I felt they really didn't acknowledge the history very much. I think that's changed in the last 5 years, dramatically changed in the last 5 years. And I think this is part of what they're trying to do.
Could you talk a little bit more about the parallels of what's going on today around the world and how it feels for you as you lived through some similar things 50, 60 years ago?
Well, I sense maybe I'm more sensitive to it than I used to be, but I think there's more anti-Semitism now in many parts of the world than there have been. I've talked a little bit about that in the beginning. And without getting into politics, I think some of our current candidates for president remind me not just a little bit about Hitler's approach to the world, which is scary. I think there are parallels. The same thing, creating fear and then providing a solution, or promising a solution, which is exactly what he did. So I'm nervous. I have to say, a couple years ago regained my German citizenship. I'm now a dual citizen. And I did that not for me, but because I'm a EU citizen. My 3 sons are, which means they can work over there if they want to. And they all speak various languages. And their children, it goes down the line. So I thought that was a really good thing to have, and I'm hoping that political climate in the U.S. is such that I don't feel motivated to move back to Germany. Other questions?
Peter,
Yes, Paul?
have you seen any of your father's art?
Have I seen any of my father's art? Well, obviously the way we left, with 2 minutes' notice, you don't pack paintings. And so I did not have any. Right after the wall came down, I took our 3 sons and Barbara back to East Germany because I wanted them to see it before it changed. And obviously I couldn't have gone before the wall came down because I would have been arrested. So we went back to Zittau, and I showed them, what that town was like. And one evening we walked to a house where my parents' best friends had lived many, many, many years ago, and we saw their last name on a nameplate, and rang the doorbell and nobody answered. But apparently their son, whom I had played with, still lived in that same building all these years later. And we went back to our hotel, and at 11 o'clock the manager comes up and says, "There's somebody here to see you." We went downstairs, and it was my parents' friend's son. He says, "You've got to come back, get dressed, come back to the apartment. I want you to meet my wife," and this and that. So we went back, had a glass of wine, and I was looking at his wall, and there was something, that painting looks somehow familiar. And he says, "Should be, it's your dad's." Big oil painting, and I said, "It's amazing, I don't have that." He said, "Take it." He rolled it up. It's now hanging in my office in Boulder. The lady that was forced to put us up for a couple of years also had 1 or 2 of his paintings. The housekeeper, I think, lived to be 102 or something. She had one of his paintings, and she put in her will that I get it. So I have a couple of those paintings. Thank you for asking. Yes.
How about dreams or nightmares? Would you have them?
Did I have dreams or nightmares? No, certainly not about that. I know my mother did throughout her life, and I suspect my dad did. But, you know, actually, the troubles in East Germany are more memorable in a sense than what happened during the Nazi regime, because I was older. So a lot of those things, you know, I was between 0 and 7 years old during that time, and that kind of rolled off my back. Whereas the problems in East Germany, I think I remember much more vividly. But no, I sleep well because I have a clear conscience. Yes?
Peter, I have to ask you how your parents trusted governments after living under Nazi tyranny.
Oh.
Communist, Spain, Japanese, and then moving to the United States.
How did my parents trust government?
Or countries.
Well, you know, yeah, not too many people have lived under fascism, communism, and capitalism. So that's a nice basis for comparison, and on balance, I like capitalism best. You know, governments is made up of people, and there are crappy people and there are nice people in any kind of government. And I think they tended to focus more on the people that helped them save their lives. I mean, you know, there are a lot of Jews who went through this who wouldn't drive a German car, wouldn't ever think about going back to Germany or something like that. And I can understand that, but I don't believe in collective guilt. And I do know that without the help of a lot of very courageous non-Jewish Germans, we could not have survived. And so I think it's important to remember that aspect as well as all the crap that went on. Sorry. Yes.
Did your parents ever speak about their families?
Did my parents speak about their families? Of course. Yeah. I mean, you know, we lost almost 40 people, I think, in the past. And maybe not necessarily, you know, around the dinner table, but my mother, as I said, made 18 or 19 audio tapes.
Oh, yeah.
And she talked quite a bit about having lost her sister in the bombing raid and all of that. So they talked about it, yeah. But they were very positive people in spite of it all. I mean, it's amazing to me, but they focused on the good things, which is probably what got them through this. Steve?
Maybe this is related to 2 questions ago, but to what do you attribute your lack of bitterness growing up and avoiding becoming, for lack of a better term, a professional victim or whatever? And this lack of bitterness really accounts for so much of your success, your positive outlook on life.
I don't know if there are any psychiatrists in the room. Just walked out, I think, one of them. I think, well, first of all, bitterness, you know, causes more trouble than it's worth, because it doesn't change anything that happened, and it just screws you up, my view. So I tend to focus on the fact that I've had a hell of a good life and it's not over. Whether that had much to do with success, I don't know. Somebody last time asked me what the effect of all of this has been on me, and I said, who the hell knows? Would I have been the wonderful human being that I am if all of this hadn't happened? I don't know, because I don't know what the flip side would have been. But bitterness is useless, I think. And again, you can focus on all the help you got over the years, and you know, positive outlook on life affects people around you, and that may be part of success in business and in life. Good question. I don't have a really good answer. Yes?
One more, Peter. Would you tell the group the story about when your mother was ill and you went to visit her and told her you were going to Africa on a trip.
Well, my mother was a very practical woman, and as I said, Barbara and I have traveled a lot, and I remember, and my mother didn't really like it when we went away for any long time, but she was quite old. So one time, Barbara and I went on one of our safaris in Africa, and my mother was very unhappy about that, and she said, you know, why do you have to go to Africa? Why don't you go to the Denver Zoo? They got the same animals. Is that what you're talking about? She was a very funny lady. She, as I said, she played a lot of bridge. She went to tournaments in Denver and in Las Vegas very often. And when she was like 91 or so, she had some trouble walking down to the hall where all the tables were set up. So she would call a bellboy at the hotel and say, I have a bag to bring down. And when the bellboy showed up, she says, I'm the old bag. Can you take me to the conference center? Yes?
I was wondering if there are still any people that continue to live in Shanghai.
Are there any Jewish people?
Yes.
Yeah, quite a few Chinese, I understand. Are there still any Jewish people living in Shanghai? Very few from that generation, because they did not have good memories of being there. There is a small Jewish community there. There's still a museum that we saw. Mr. Wong runs it, the Jewish Museum. And I would guess that most of the Jews who are living there work for Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and are, expats working over there. I'm sure there's some Jews, Russian Jews and a few other, but it's not a large Jewish community as far as I know. Yes?
So from what I've heard, speaking of Jews living in those places, many Jews from Russia and Israel have moved back to Germany, or have moved to Germany.
Yes, the question was, are there not a lot of Jews back in Germany from Russia and Eastern Europe? And the answer is yes. I would say the great majority of the Jews we've seen in Germany are from Russia. For example, I mentioned there's a very small synagogue in Dresden where my bar mitzvah was. Last time we went back, there's a huge new synagogue there with Russian guards, Russian Jewish guards with machine guns outside. So I would say the majority of the Jews in Germany now are from Russia or from other Eastern European countries. Not a lot of the original Jews came back. But I also have to say that they're not particularly religious. They left Russia for economic reasons or for other reasons, but they're not constituting a very strong religious group, as best I can tell. Any questions from students? It's your class. The professor is watching. How are we doing time-wise, okay?
I think it's time to show our appreciation for
Thank you.